Welcome to Monday Night Live. My name is Brendan Malone, and in this episode we're going to be speaking to Dr. Chris Pemberton. Before I introduce Chris, though, let me just say a huge thank you to all of our supporters at patreon.com/leftfootmedia. You guys are awesome, and it's thanks to you that this episode was made possible. If you're not already a member of our patron community, you can join us right now for as little as $1 a month or as much as you'd like to contribute at patreon.com/leftfootmedia. That's patreon.com/leftfootmedia. Not only will you be helping to ensure that more of this great content keeps getting made, but you'll also receive exclusives that are only available to our Patreon supporters. Right, back to our guest for this episode. Dr. Chris Pemberton has both PhD and master's degrees, and after completing his PhD on the biochemical forms of BNP in experimental heart failure, he travelled to Finland to gain postdoctoral training in isolated organ techniques. Upon his return to the Department of Medicine at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, he established the Isolated Heart Facility at the Christchurch Heart Institute. The main focus of Chris's research has been the discovery of circulating factors in the blood that could potentially be used to address areas of unmet clinical need in the diagnosis and management of cardiovascular disease. In 2011, he was awarded the Health Research Council Liley Medal and currently heads the Translational Biodiscovery Laboratory, as well as being a member of the senior leadership team of the CHI. He is also CSO of the diagnostic company Upstream Medical Technologies, which he co-founded in 2015. His current research focuses on developing tests for COVID antibody measurement and their potential application to population-based studies in New Zealand. So, without any further ado, let's have this very important conversation with Dr. Chris Pemberton about COVID, about vaccines, and about the current state of the global pandemic and what might lie ahead for us. Chris, thanks so much for being with us here today. I was umming and ahhing about where we should start our conversation because it seems to me in the last couple of weeks that everything has radically transformed as far as the COVID landscape goes. So I thought I would start with perhaps I would burrow right down into a question that's manageable to start with, and that is, everyone's talking about Delta. What the heck is up with the Delta variant? Is it more dangerous, or is it just the fact that it's more easily transmissible and therefore the danger is it's a problem of scale, so more people can get infected a lot more quickly rather than it being individually more lethal for someone? Tell us a bit about the Delta variant.
Yeah, well, thanks, Brendan. It's a pleasure to be on your show. The Delta variant, is it more dangerous? I don't think we really know enough about it yet. If you go and look at global data on publicly available websites like Our World in Data and Worldometer and things like that, if you look at the Northern Hemisphere, which has had the bulk of it, infections and problems, you would probably think that it's, if anything, it's slightly less lethal. But because it's a variant and the way the vaccines are designed, there is a suggestion that it's escaping the vaccination-induced protection, and we can come to the vaccines later on. But I think Delta is certainly more infectious. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Viruses undergo mutations all the time, and they have to in order to survive, right? That's their thing. So it comes as no surprise that as a virus like this, once it's released newly into a population, in a human population, it's known that they will mutate in order to survive and spread. So it is more infectious. I don't think there's any doubt about that. What I personally find particularly interesting is, I mean, we're seeing the case in Sydney right now as it's unfolded since the beginning of June, really. Now, we're almost 2 months into that, and I have to say, I'm not impressed with the total case numbers of Delta. I think they're up to something like 5,000-6,000 numbers there. Now, I'm not downplaying the seriousness, but of course it's serious. If it was more infectious, I would have expected more, but I don't know. I mean, we don't know where it is in the cycle. I mean, if you come back in 2 months' time, it may be 10 times that number, in which case, yes, of course, that sort of thing. And we don't know what effect the lockdown is having in Sydney, because Australians are not, they don't tend to be as compliant as New Zealanders. And their idea of lockdown up till now has been quite different to ours. For argument's sake, I have relatives in Queensland. On the very day they were locked down, my brother-in-law took his kids around to his grandparents. I mean, there's no way you could do that here. So, there's different rules, but take-home message is, yes, I think Delta is clearly more infectious. Is it more lethal? I mean, the jury's out on that. I tend to think not. The British government released data. They were always releasing data in reports. And to my knowledge, the last data I saw, the mortality rate from Delta was around about 0.3%, which was substantially lower than the original variant that came out of Wuhan. I know you're not allowed to use the word Wuhan, but I'm going to use it because that's where it came from. That's another topic. So, the first wave and the second wave. But, we're just going to have to wait and see. And that's the thing with this pandemic. We don't know anything about it. It's new, right?
Yeah.
And I think we're at a really critical point right now, at this point in time, like right now.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you there. And I want to talk to that. I want to ask you about that point in just a second, because I think right now things have ramped up and changed in a way that's not as healthy as it was previously. Before we get to that, though, we're already seeing articles now talking about the lambda variant, so the next variant, and I saw an article the other day hyping it up as even more lethal again. Again, do journalists really have the ability to say that and eschew, there's such headlines that suggest with absolute certainty about the danger of lambda when we still don't even really understand Delta?
Well, lambda's come out of South America, so Delta originally came out of India. And it's substantially, remember the UK variant was the first thing that we were all hearing about. And then Delta's come out of India, and that substantially replaced the UK variant very quickly, which is not surprising. Lambda has come out of South America, and we're hearing reports that it could be more lethal. But when you actually go and look at it on a country-by-country basis, Peru really stands out. Peru and Colombia stand out as countries quite apart from the rest. And there are publications coming out. Now, Lambda's a little bit different from Delta. Delta doesn't have a mutational change that Lambda does. Delta's got some very expected kind of mutations and key points. Lambda's different. It's got this large mutational change in what's called a supersite, which is used to evade the immune system. And so if you're producing antibodies to a virus as part of your body's immune system protection, there are known supersites that antibodies kind of lock into. It's kind of like the first part of the footstep that they get in to stop the virus from getting into your cells. Lambda's got a deletion mutation in this area, which kind of gets around that. So again, it kind of makes it more infectious. Whether it's more lethal, I don't know. And this is where a lot of uncertainty comes in. If you look in England, it's registered as a variant under investigation. It's not a variant of concern, and we can talk about what those terms mean later on. But it certainly wreaked havoc in Peru and things like that. But there's two components to that. You have to look at infection and what it's doing to the people, and then you have to look at a country's ability to be able to handle it. I don't know the healthcare system in Peru that well, but my suspicions are that maybe it got on top of them and they didn't do anything as well as they should have. I'm not criticising them. I'm just saying that's what may have happened, because if you go and look at if you look at Chile, for instance, they fared a lot better. Plus, in terms of population, population density is a huge factor in things like this. So I think we need to be aware of Delta, but I'm on the fence on that one at the moment. I don't know whether it's more lethal. Yeah.
Here's a question for you, because we've heard this mantra a lot throughout the pandemic. It sort of started early on. People would repeat, viruses, they mutate weaker. So, mutations are actually a welcome thing because it mutates weaker and weaker and weaker. Is that an actual scientific rule, though, or is that one of those sort of popular truisms that may or may not be the case, depending on what exactly you're dealing with at any given moment?
As a general rule, I think it tends to be true that if you're a virus and you're killing all your hosts, you're not going to live for very long. That's a fairly common sense. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure that one out. And, you take the case of something like Ebola or the original SARS or the Middle Eastern respiratory virus. Those things have been fairly well controlled by a lockdown, which has prevented spread, and they burn themselves out. And that's what happened with the original SARS, in particular in China. With regards to mutation, any mutation that a virus can do that is working towards increasing its survivability is a truism. And we know from some of the variants that have come out, I think it was the UK variant, where the key that the virus uses to get into your cells is known as the spike protein. And I'm pretty sure it was in the UK variant, that key mutated so that it would bind the component on your cells, but then it would snap off and kind of like leave half the key in the door lock. Yeah. But the rest of the virus never got into the cell to replicate, because that's what viruses do. They hijack your cellular machinery in order to reproduce themselves. And what that did was that meant that you may have had a high viral load, but if it's not getting into your cells and replicating itself too much, it gives it the ability to pass on to the next person. And so with that, there's a general rule, less virulence is the phrase. People these days seem to be confused between infectiousness and virulence. They're two different things. Infectiousness relates to the rate of transmission, and virulence means, is it going to kill you or not? So as a general rule, increased infectiousness does tend to result in lower virulence. But, you can never say never. I don't think there's anybody on the face of the planet, even the most ardent anti-vaxxer or anyone like that would have to admit, we just don't know at this point whether things are going to mutate into, horror movie levels of bodies in the street with a highly virulent, highly infectious strain. I personally think that's highly unlikely, but, we'll see.
Let's talk a little bit about Ivamectin, one of those great controversial areas. And I'm quite aware that this video may even get disbarred for even mentioning the I word. But it seems to me that there's been initially that there was a lot of pushback. I think it got politicized very early on, it's fair to say. And a lot of people were conflating it with Trump, even though he was talking about a completely different drug. But they sort of conflated anything that wasn't vaccine or from official accepted sources, and it was somehow part of Trump's bad anti-science, terrible medicine, and you don't want to listen to it. But it seems now of late there is more of a conversation starting to happen. But what does the research that we do have, which I understand is limited, what does it show us about Ivamectin? Because you keep hearing conflicting reports from different sources about whether it can work as a prophylaxis or help with the people who've got it, all that sort of stuff.
Well, I think Trump was talking about hydroxychloroquine, and he wasn't helped with the suggestion that you could put bleach in your arm. That's not a good look. But hydroxychloroquine, it became very political very quickly. And I have to say, this whole pandemic, from a research point of view, is the most political thing I have ever come across. I have never seen such an intersection of politics and health research in a particular environment as I've seen with this, probably because it's required both politics and health to get us out of it. So with hydroxychloroquine, that got really, a lot of people didn't really accept it. And there was a study which came out, I think it was in the Lancet, and it was made up. They claimed that they got hospital data from all over Africa and all those over the other countries. It was made up. It was made up by some BS artist in America who reckoned he had this amazing company which could collect all this. It was just made up. But the point was made. Hydroxychloroquine came under a lot of pressure. Subsequently, people did trials with it in the US, and it didn't work in severe COVID patients in the hospital. There are those out there who think hydroxychloroquine works in an early stage COVID infection or as a prophylactic. I'm not up to speed on that. Ivermectin, on the other hand, there has been a publication in the American Journal of Therapeutics which looked at a number of different trials, both kind of observational or minimal intervention, right through to some RCTs, which were small in number and everything. But the data does seem pretty clear to me, at least anyway, that ivermectin is something worth pursuing, and we really should be looking at it. Now, I know in England there's a trial going on at the moment called the Principal trial, and this is run by a guy out of Oxford. He's highly respected, and he's been commenting on all different aspects of the COVID epidemic over there. And to my knowledge, the trial is very simple, but it's very elegant. It works like this. You can download an app on your phone, and if you get a positive PCR test for having the COVID virus and or if you've got symptoms or whatever, you relay this information on the app to the trial investigators, and then they send you out in the post some ivermectin. And to my knowledge, this is an RCT. They're randomizing it so that not everybody who logs in on the app gets the material. One issue will be as to whether people are compliant. It's very hard to judge at a distance whether people are compliant. But if they take the ivermectin as directed, we're going to find out whether it really does work in the pre-hospital sense. And the article that I referred to in the American Journal of Therapeutics, it does seem to suggest if you give it to someone early or as a prophylactic, before infection to prevent COVID infection, it does seem to work. And I remember reading somewhere that the Indian government was giving out ivermectin to people at the height of the Delta spread. So towards the end of last year, they had ivermectin as a policy, and they were handing it out in packets and instructions on how to give it. Vaccines came in. They started vaccinating people. They pulled the ivermectin back. And then quietly at the beginning of March this year, they re-implemented the ivermectin. So are we seeing an effect there of both vaccination and ivermectin as well? I tend to favour the latter because only 6% of the latest antibody survey, only 6% of people in India have been vaccinated, doubly vaccinated, but 67% of the population are reported to have antibodies to COVID.
Wow.
Now, this is the Delta variant, remember. Now, 67% of 1.2 billion people is a lot of people. Yeah. So, I would have expected more deaths than they've got. They've got a lot of deaths, there's no doubt about that. But when you consider the scale of India, and if those numbers are right, what happened?
Yeah.
Was ivermectin actually useful? I don't know, but I believe it's a question that needs to be investigated.
Well, that's a good point. And here's a question to do with that, because I want to talk about vaccines in just a second. But is there a bit of a fault in the system, if you like? You're in this space. You know research in the medical space. You know biotechnologies and medical technologies and how the sort of commercial side of it works as well. Do you think there's a fault in the system that everyone governmentally at the top focused on vaccines as the solution, and then so ivermectin got pushed aside, and perhaps it's not even as lucrative because it's a cheaper product and more readily available, and so not even in a great conspiracy, it's just, look, no, we're not doing that, we're doing vaccines, shut up. Is that a possibility here, that just sort of the system switched off to other options because it was so fixated on vaccines and the belief that they would be the only cure?
I don't know why things have played out the way they did. It would seem to make good sense that at the same time you're saying vaccines, shouldn't you be rolling out effective treatments and therapies for this? You should be expending just as much energy on finding these things out. Now, ivermectin actually came out of an Australian lab where people had the virus in cell cultures, and they were looking at what tried to kill it. And people were scrambling for anything. And so they were pulling all sorts of things off the shelf that they knew were drugs or antifungals or whatever. And boom, they gave ivermectin to the cell culture of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and it nobbled it. It basically halted it in its tracks. And so that kind of thing you would have thought would have spurred a bit more activity in clinical trials. But to be fair to the authorities, it's very hard to do that kind of thing when you've got health systems that are overloaded and you've got incredibly dedicated professionals in ICU, doctors, nurses, the whole health system, even the guy who's the porter walking around taking patients from one place to another, ambulance staff, the whole 9 yards, they're overloaded. That the last thing they want to do is get involved in too many trials. having said that, though, they have been trying their own things. So what came out of in England in particular, the use of dexamethasone and other corticosteroids and things like that, which are suppressing overactive immune responses, which can lead to things. But I would have thought at like a governance level within countries, you would have expected, because they've spent billions. I mean, Trump with his warp speed and Boris Johnson with all the other things that I don't know the name of the programs they had over there, but, they spent billions on vaccines to say, let's buy them, let's get them into the population. This is the way out of that. I would have thought that, a fraction of that even, if they'd have spent 20% of that budget on looking at effective therapies, it would have been a two-armed approach because, the medical professionals deserve it. There's nothing worse than a doctor to sit there and go, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to have to work this out myself. If they've got something else that they can try, or if they're hearing about things and being allowed to implement it, because if you've got a COVID patient on a ventilator and you've got their family who's worried and you're all doused in PPE and, it was horrible, you're probably you're more inclined to try anything really, aren't you? It's a no-win situation. And I would have thought that more support would have happened. Why it's only coming to the fore now? We hear Anthony Fauci talking about, the need for certain, COVID pills and things like that. Is it a case of people, they finally caught their breath and now they can focus on this now because they wanted to let the vaccines do the work first, or they dropped the ball? I don't know, but I do think now, and that's why I said before, we're at a critical juncture now. I don't think we can afford to behave the same way again. Yeah. Too many people are going to get caught in the backwash, the law of unintended consequences. So I do think we need to be pushing forward with effective treatments now.
Let's talk about vaccines. And I should start these next few questions I want to ask you about vaccines by saying neither of us, very clearly, we're not anti-vax. I want to make that absolutely clear.
No.
We want to be really clear on that because what normally, there's a lot of false dichotomy at the moment. So people even want to have the conversation and probe at it in a reasoned and I would say rational kind of way, are straight away accused of being science deniers and anti-vaxxers who want to kill people. And that's neither of us. But I want to ask this question to you, Chris. Have vaccines helped? Are they working? We're hearing new advice now that perhaps we should be staggering the two doses even more, the duration between the two even longer to try and maximize immunity. Does that perhaps point to the fact that we rushed this a little bit? I guess that's understandable because of the crisis, but are they working? What's happening with vaccines?
I think that there's two kind of components to that. There's an answer that a medical person or a researcher will give you, and then there's the answer that a politician will give you. And there's probably a third answer that the pharmaceutical executive will give you. The politician wants to get re-elected, so vaccines are the answer. The pharmaceutical executive wants to make a ton of money, and he's thinking about his shareholders, and so he'll say, you need to get vaccinated. The medical person or the researcher might be a little bit more circumspect about it. I think on the whole, vaccines at the moment, the weight of the evidence is pointing towards it's reducing symptoms in people who've received both shots. And so that is actually it's good for the person if they don't get such a serious case, and it's good for the health system because it means they're less likely to go into hospital. I'm a little concerned not with the concept of the vaccination. I'm concerned with the actual design of the vaccines. I think it's an inferior design. That's my own personal opinion. And I can understand they had to do something, but what's been lost in the whole situation at the moment. And again, it's not like there isn't the money to do something about this, and there are trials coming forward. So if you got infected with COVID, you're getting the whole virus. And just to give people a concept about this, the virus that causes you to get COVID, it's around about 30,000 nucleotides long. It's what's called a single-stranded RNA. That encodes for a ton of proteins, because we know from our RNA and DNA, you get proteins that get produced, and they're functional components of your body. And then there's two proteins in particular. There's the spike protein and there's the nucleocapsid protein. There are other proteins, but there are two other proteins as well. And I'll call them ORF, ORF. There's 2 of them. And they encode for proteins which get further cut up by enzymes. And that produces around about 16 other mini proteins out of that. Those 16 proteins are all involved with trying to fool your immune system. They're working, trying to modulate your immune system. They're trying to evade, capture by your circulating T cells and antibodies. They're involved with trying to suppress other functions in order for the virus to survive. That's its mechanism. That's part of its process, right? Now, the vaccines at the moment are only giving you the spike protein, and it's a logical start point because that's how the virus gets into the cell. But when you get given the spike protein, you are only going to raise antibodies to that spike protein. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to a natural infection, there's all these other components to deal with. So in terms of mutation, if the virus mutates in the spike protein, it's going to evade that. Now, when you get the flu vaccine, that's deactivated or attenuated virus. It's the whole virus, and that's why the flu vaccine is so effective. I am aware there are studies now and research projects looking at attenuated COVID virus, giving as a vaccine the entire virus, which I think will allow your body to give a more complete response, and thus generate a better immune profile. So I have concerns about the design of the vaccines, but I fully understand why, in the interest of time, they had to rush through and get it through. So, but however, overall, vaccinations, the concept of doing it, I understand it, and I kind of agree with what they're trying to do. If you're reducing individual burden of COVID infection and a systemic health system burden, that's a good thing, right?
Tell me then, let me ask this as a real simpleton layman, because if I understand things correctly, any other vaccine I get, as you say, it's normally attenuated virus, and that means you create an immunity, so you don't get the thing when it comes knocking on your door. This one's different, and you say obviously you can see the logic of targeting the spike protein and trying to reduce the burden on the healthcare system and the number of deaths, etc. But this one you can still get, and you can still pass on the virus. That seems to be the case, if I'm correct about that. So, is this actually a vaccine, or is it a therapeutic then? I mean, is there a bit of confusion, if you like, that's been created, or are there other vaccines that work the same way, where you can still contract it, but it doesn't do as much harm? Or is this unusual?
I think what needs to be clear is that, if you get a flu vaccine or a tetanus shot, you can still get the flu or tetanus, and it's because of influenza vaccination that we don't get so many cases as we used to. It's a misnomer that you won't get the flu if you're vaccinated. You will get it. Vast majority of cases, they're just not aware they've got it because your immune system's gone, that's it, I'm done, Yeah. That's how they work. What we've got now, they're vaccines. That they're designed to be vaccines. They're designed to function like a vaccine. I just think, like I said before, in the interest of time, they had to do something, and the quickest thing to do was to block the viral entry into the cell. And now later on, they're working on these other attenuated vaccines. I think the tetanus vaccine, I don't think it's the whole thing. I think you get one important component of it, an important protein component of it. MMR, they're attenuated. So, I just think what's happening now is the COVID vaccination, because it's a pandemic and they've had to quickly get them out. I think what's happening now, and it seems to me to be playing out this way, is that the COVID vaccination schedule is kind of catching up to where flu vaccinations and everything have got to. And I definitely think that's the end game. People want a decent, lasting vaccination that'll work.
Does that mean booster shots are going to be required? Because it seems that's the drum that's beating now, but you never know.
If they stay, yeah. If they stayed just as a spike protein vaccine based sort of system, I think you would have to get booster shots because the spike protein is going to mutate, right? And other regions are going to mutate. What's interesting, though, is that we know the mutation in the virus, in the SARS-CoV-2 virus, it's kind of around about the same as influenza. So it may or may not be stable in terms of its eventual rate. I think a lot of clear, level-headed thinking is needed going forward and planning this, because the last thing we want to do is enter into a situation of perpetual rushing and fear and running about it. There needs to be calm, level-headed data collection, thinking, and strategies going forward. And again, that comes back to my point before. We're at a very crucial point now. Are we going to continue in this constant kind of playing catch-up or not? And I think they're decisions that the senior boffins, the medical advisors, the vaccinologists, the policymakers, the politicians have all got to communicate very clearly to the public about this, because I think there's a growing disquiet that they're starting to lose control, and nobody wants that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I want to talk about that in just a second. Just one last question about vaccines. What about the issue of vaccine hesitancy? We hear a lot about that these days. Which, by the way, I think people who want to be rational and engage in genuine sociability should differentiate between vaccine hesitancy and anti-vax. They're not the same thing at all. And to sort of just, to insult someone and say, well, because they're waiting, they're an anti-vax, it's not true. It's not helpful to society's cohesion. How long do you think, though, before you can have trust, if you like, if you're someone who's waiting, in the long-term safety of a vaccine? So how long does it take before you can say, okay, now I can say I don't need to be hesitant, there's enough long-term data for me to say I'm okay to get jabbed?
Well, that's a very interesting question. People in France and Italy now don't have that choice. There are vaccine passports. If you want to go to the cafe and sit out on the road, even outdoors, or go to a venue where there's going to be more than 50 people, I think is the thing. If you want to get on a plane and fly, you've got to be double vaccinated, and you've got to have proof of that. Either that, or you've got to have a PCR test that's no more than, I think it's 72 or 48 hours old or something like that. But nobody wants to keep getting something shoved up their nose for a PCR test, just to go down the shop to buy some biscuits, do they? That's a ridiculous. Of course you're going to choose the vaccine. There are, I think this is coming through, and there's already talk in the media by various bods here in New Zealand about, vaccine passports and things are going to be a feature of the future. Now, in terms of choosing which vaccine you want, I personally believe that the public have a right to choose which vaccine they want. Yes, I'll take a vaccine, but you're not going to tell me which one. And I personally believe that there should be options. And to be fair, the New Zealand government is doing that. They've given you options. We've got the Pfizer-based one, which is not really Pfizer. They're just distributing it. It's actually made by BioNTech. There's the AstraZeneca one. There's, I think, the Janssen one. It's funny, isn't it? The company Janssen and Johnson have got together, and you've got Janssen. That's kind of amusing.
Triple J,
Yeah. So, isn't that a radio station in Melbourne or something?
In Australia, it is,
Yeah. Maybe they're in on it. Who knows? And there's one coming. There's one coming that I'm particularly interested in, and it's from a company called Novavax, and that's an old school type vaccine that has gone through the type of sort of manufacturing processing. We can get into the ethics of vaccines later on if you want, in terms of their production and testing and everything like that. I don't know if we're going to go there.
Let's talk about that now, because I think that's a key question, right? Because it seems to me there's two distinct questions here. One is the ethics of forcing people to have a vaccine before they are, their properly formed conscience allows them to say yes, so you're sort of going against their freedom of conscience. The second one is the source of a vaccine. So, the second ethical question is, well, did this involve an aborted fetal cell line? So can you perhaps give us a little bit of, your thoughts on those particular questions?
So to my knowledge and all the searching and the reading that I've done, and that at the moment, the options that are available to the New Zealand public don't present an opportunity to get away from the use of aborted fetal cell lines in either the manufacture or the testing. It's predominantly the testing that they used, and they used, there's a PR1, but certainly the HEK293 cell line is used in the testing. Now, this does not mean, and I've got to be clear about this, aborted fetal cell line are not components of the vaccine. They're not in the vaccine. That we've got to be perfectly clear about that. The majority is they use the cell lines for testing to see if the vaccine inhibits viral entry into the cells. And I know that people have questions about that, and I know that that's an important consideration going forward. And the vaccine I mentioned before, Novavax, appears to use the PER1 cell line. I think it's either the HEK293 or the PER1 cell line. There are other companies out there making vaccines that don't rely on those things, but they're nowhere near as advanced. The clinical trial stages are not as advanced. So I think we will be waiting a while for this. And one thing that's really sort of struck me is that there was a real opportunity for those who have objections based on that, and I'm not criticizing them. I think they're perfectly allowed to have the vaccine any more than an anti-vivisectionist or a vegan won't eat, certain things based on their beliefs. I believe people are perfectly entitled to behave like that. You've got the right to choose freedom of belief, is an important fundamental right of a democratic society. But I also think they've missed an opportunity there to present a valid option rapidly. Now, what form would that take? I think it's very important that people need to realise if you don't like something, do something about it. And it can be done in perfectly legal and logical ways. Fundraise, get money, get together as groups and try and push money. If you're from a faith-based institution or if you're from a philosophical-based institution or something like that, petition the leaders of those institutions to say, hey, why aren't you helping support these kinds of what we would consider ethical sort of approaches to the problem? I think that's something that could happen. Now, coming back to Novavax, so I hope that's dealt with the ethics thing.
well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think that's a great point you've made about trying to. Here was an opportunity, perhaps. Even I know, for example, a lot of voices within the Christian church were talking about this, and some very clear and good enunciation of the fact that in Christian moral philosophy, your proximity to a particular action, so the abortion that resulted in that cell line happened decades ago, and the proximity to it does change, the moral question a bit. But also at the same time, we do know that we're in a market-driven economy. And so if the market makes different choices, the manufacturers are forced to go ethical, right? If we said, no, we're not having it. And so it felt a little bit to me, it feels a little bit like, even in some Christian leadership circles, that point has been lost, where they haven't really stressed, well, here's an opportunity to actually do something and sort of demand a change in the market, right?
Yeah, I mean, you don't even have to demand a change in the market. You can just present an alternative to the way the market functions. And I really feel quite strongly there's been a missed opportunity there to do something like that. I don't know. It may change. Maybe somebody might watch this interview and think, well, we better do something about that.
Let me ask you a question then. Do you think, I guess this is a question I haven't heard asked to many people actually, and I've never thought about it myself, but do you think there would ever be a situation where you personally would say, I think it would be unethical not to take a vaccine?
Yeah, I think there are very clear indications about that. Sophisticated philosophical, religious, any type of kind of paradigms that over half the planet ascribes to has thought long and hard about these kinds of things over the millennia, and I think there are very clear situations where you kind of do have to do something, and you may not like it, and you're pushed into a corner, right? But if you were in the middle of Africa and you had Ebola, I mean, and you had to make a choice about behaving in a certain way, what are you going to do? And we encounter that in our daily lives all the time. It doesn't have to be a pandemic. There are just things that you should do, however personally unpalatable you might find it, it's still the right thing to do. And the paradigms that we all know, you don't need to name them. They've thought long and hard about these kinds of things, and I know that this with regards to, say, an organisation like the Catholic Church, it's got the CDF, the Congregation for the Dogmatic Faith, and they ponder these questions for centuries, and they put out a release. I think it was 2006 or 2005 after SARS, and then they put out one last year saying, in a situation where there is no other alternative for the common good, it's okay to take these vaccines because of principles of remote cooperation and things like that. These are not arbitrary philosophical abstract thought that some guy in a frock in Rome's just gone, oh, let's do this before we go and have a latte or an espresso somewhere. They're based on real world application. They're not. They're present. They're real to life that goes on every day. Now, people can say, well, I don't have to pay attention to that or anything like that. I'm not sure that that's necessarily an approach that I would take, which is why I'm going on about there needs to be alternatives, because I think that's a better approach, or it's one approach.
Yeah.
I think there's alternate ways of dealing with it.
Well, this is an interesting question, because it seems to me that what's sort of lying at the heart of the current, if you like, social tension that is really spilling over in lots of places around the globe right now.
America is feral.
Yeah, and you see this in Europe and rallies, and even in Australia. It seems to me that we've just assumed that the only two options on the table are some sort of perhaps authoritarian or totalitarian enforcement, or expressive individualism, liberalism, the autonomous self-choosing individual. And I'm saying, hold on, that's a false dichotomy. There's a third way here, which is the traditional Christian natural law perspective, which was really the Western perspective before liberalism became so dominant, was that, well, no, we don't ever trample on an individual's legitimate rights and freedoms, but we also must consider and act for the common good, and that's a good and humane and moral thing to do. So you don't ever get stuck between those two extremes, and it seems that conversation's not even happening.
Yeah. So let's bring it to a very real, clear focus. If you're in a position of work and you have to get vaccinated in order to keep your job, and you go, well, no, I have an ethical objection to that, I have a conscientious objection, that's fine. But, as Peter Parker got told when he became Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. In other words, actions have consequences. And if you lose your job and you can't support your family, that's fairly serious. And if enough people do that, you're going to have that's got serious ramifications on society. And then interpersonal relationships suffer, macro relationships in a street or in communities suffer, and this is the kind of thinking that we know that serious, sophisticated philosophical and religious regimes, they thought about this. It's not just some boffin in a tower somewhere who has these kind of suggestions. That's my phone, I'm just going to ignore it. You really do have to think long and hard about this. To my mind, at least, we have to make the best of a bad situation. I have not taken the Pfizer vaccine at the moment. I'm waiting for the Novavax one for two reasons. First and primo is the data. I simply believe the Nova vaccine, the data that I've seen that's come out of the clinical studies, I think it's a superior product. And it's made with an old school kind of technology that I personally feel more comfortable with. I'm not criticizing the mRNA systems. It's a very clever system. There's no doubt about that. It's just that I don't know enough about it. We've not seen it in the world. And I've got colleagues from all over the world, and you look at them blank in the eye, and they admit this is the greatest medical experiment on a large scale that the world has ever seen. And I've got one colleague from the US who's a very well-respected senior medical official, and he said on the call the other day, he goes, "There's no way we would have got ethics to do this. It's been forced by necessity. In a normal situation, there's no way you would get ethics to do what they're doing with regards to the vaccination rollouts. But that's trumped by the seriousness of the situation, right? You have to do it.
Yeah.
So, I'm personally, I'm waiting for the Novavax one. But at the same time as doing that, we need to be pushing towards, okay, we really may not feel that comfortable about this, but we're not going to let this situation happen again. We need to be prepared, because there will be another situation where we have to be ready and present a viable alternative. And you just might find that, you don't just drag, the people and you hang out with, you might drag a whole lot of other people with you as well.
Yeah. Let's talk about this now. I want to talk about an article that was published in the New Zealand media yesterday. It was published just before that in the UK, the British media, and there's been something similar we're hearing from New Zealand there as well. And this is about this new report. Let me just read to you from this article some key bits of it. The headline is COVID-19 coronavirus. Delta variant has wrecked hopes of herd immunity, scientists warn. So it's pretty dire. Here's what they're saying.
It's pretty blunt too.
Yeah, there's no punches pulled there, right? So here, let me read you from the article. The Delta variant has wrecked any chance of herd immunity. A panel of experts, including the head of the Oxford vaccine team in the UK, said as they called for an end to mass testing in Britain so they can start to live with COVID. Professor Andrew Pollard, who led the Oxford vaccine team, said it was clear that the Delta variant could infect people who had been vaccinated, which made herd immunity impossible to reach even with high vaccine uptake. They also said this. Analysis by Public Health England has shown that when vaccinated people catch the virus, they have similar viral load to unvaccinated individuals and may be just as infectious. Also this, Paul Hunter, professor in medicine at the University of East Anglia, who I think you mentioned before earlier on, and an expert in infectious diseases, told the committee, the concept of herd immunity is unachievable because we know the infection will spread in unvaccinated populations, and the latest data is suggesting the 2 doses is probably only 50% protective against infection. Hunter, who advises the World Health Organization on COVID, also said it was time to change the way the data was collected and recorded as the virus became endemic. We need to start moving away from just reporting infections or just reporting positive cases admitted to hospital to actually start reporting the number of people who are ill because of COVID, he added. Otherwise, we are going to be frightening ourselves with very high numbers that actually don't translate into disease burden. Now, there was something similar. Professor Skegg here in New Zealand had some similar sentiments in a report that was also published in the media yesterday here in New Zealand. So we're pre-recording this on Thursday, so that was Wednesday. Now, it seems to me this is, although it hasn't so far really, the bonfire hasn't taken off, it seems this is really quite a serious sort of admission, if you like, of well, things have changed again in quite a dramatic way. So people running around talking about vaccine passports and everything else, that'd be useless if what they're saying is true here, right? Because even a vaccine doesn't actually mean that you're much more of a safe proposition to be around in a sense, right? So is this a game changer? What's happening here?
Yeah, I think, context is everything here. And, England got ravaged, the UK got ravaged by COVID, there's no doubt about that. And so they're in a position now where they've got a lot of people who have acquired immunity, which is they've had COVID and beaten it. They've had, a horrible number of deaths, there's no doubt about that. And then the other side of the equation is they've got, I think they're close to 70% of the population now has received double vaccination. I think that's right. It's certainly 50% of the population has been vaccinated double as well, with a variety of different vaccines. And so they're coming at it from the point of view of they've had a population that has seen the virus run through and run rampant, and then they're very far advanced in the vaccination program. And so they're kind of like, well, okay, it's kind of getting to the point now where, what else are we going to do? Well, treatment is number one. And I think that's what Professor Pollard and Turner are getting at, is that there's not much point now in just doing PCRs and then shutting everything down. It's not really going to do anything. And if what I reported right, I'm pretty sure it was correct, that with the Delta variant, they're looking at around about a 0.3% death rate. They're clearly moving towards, let's focus on the people who are infected, because they're the ones who get sick. They're the ones who are going to require most of our care. I don't believe that they're saying people shouldn't be vaccinated, to get the numbers up as high as they can. Now, if you've got Delta variants that are escaping current vaccinations, because what a lot of people forget is that most of the vaccines that are out there now are against the original variant. That's what they're designed to raise antibodies to, which is why, so it's no surprise in a way that the Delta variant is breaking through those kinds of things for the very reasons I talked about before with the vaccine design. So I think that's something they're considering. Now, England's not the only place to be doing this. Singapore is not going to report case numbers at the end of this year. They took the approach about 6 or 8 weeks ago and said, we've got to learn to live with this virus. And they find that. Now, Singapore is actually a really interesting case because it's an advanced society. It's got a sophisticated medical system. And they had a lot of cases, particularly among their migratory workforce who live in these border barracks, and they come in from Malaysia and all these other different countries, and it ran rampant through there. And they've had breakthrough infections as well. I suspect Singapore has got a confidence in their own ability to get on top of it in terms of localized mini lockdowns, people self-isolating at home, these other kinds of strategies that they're designing. And I think England's got to that same point now as well, where they're kind of like, okay, it's time to evolve. The virus is mutating. Our response needs to mutate too.
Okay, so can I ask a question about New Zealand? Because we're in a very different situation today.
Yeah. That's why context is important.
Yeah, so we've been spared the onslaught. So what are your thoughts about the ongoing lockdown? Like I've always said from the beginning, the initial lockdown made sense because we did not know enough, and it was clear China had lied. And so what you've got is a situation where the precautionary principle of ethics would say there's really good evidence this could cause a lot of harm to, so we need to pause until we know for certain how deadly and what's going on. We know a bit more now than we did 12 months ago, though, and the whole global situation has changed. So, for example, if the States, even Australia, if it gets out there, and it seems likely it will, if England's given up the game, it's a bit like climate change where we contribute so little that we can't hold out. Does that mean our lockdown strategy has to change? Did Sweden get it right? Were they wrong? What are your thoughts about all of that? I mean, going forward, is it the right way?
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up Sweden there, because Sweden became the whipping boy last year. And they had an approach which was actually grounded in a lot of stuff that they teach in public health and epidemiology about ring fencing the sick and taking some social measures. I mean, it's a misnomer to say that the Swedes all just sat around drinking vodka and doing what they normally do. They did have some kind of lockdown. And their chief epidemiologist, Anders Tegnell, he did admit that they didn't do enough with regards to the aged care and the retirement sectors. They had far too many deaths in that sector. But I remember seeing suggestions and reports, kind of early on through to the midway last year, that were criticising Sweden and saying they're going to have 60,000 deaths and it's all going to be horrible. And, well, they've got 14 or 15,000 deaths, something like that. It's still a high number. They have 90,000 deaths annually. Now, it's going to be really interesting to see how Sweden and the UK go, and the US actually go, because Delta's starting to rip through the US as well. It's really taking hold. They've got breakthrough cases and everything there. I think we're at a really interesting point, because if you go and look at the mortality data in the Northern Hemisphere in the winter, which is when these kinds of things come through, the mortality data can be expressed as daily deaths per million population. England got to about 18 deaths per day per million head of population, and it was cyclical. It went through the end of the winter in beginning of 2020, and then went through the winter just gone, now 2020-21. We're now at the point where Sweden followed that a bit, and so did the US, and it makes sense. We're now at the point where those graphs are starting to swing up again a little bit, and it's going to be very interesting and I believe New Zealand should really take close attention to this. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. Do those lines split? Does Sweden have less? Does it have more? How does England go with their like I said before, acquired immunity and the vaccination-based immunity on top of that? The US will be an interesting case. And I think because in the New Zealand context, we're not really talking about opening up or anything until at least next year. That's been very clear. The politicians and their specialist advice that they're getting, and as you said before, David Skegg and other commentators are saying, that don't open it now. I mean, even David Seymour's come out and said, something contrary, as David Seymour does, but even he's using 2022 as the start date, right? So I think we're fortunate here. It gives us the chance to kind of sit inside the bubble and look out and see what's happening. And I really, really, really hope that the powers that be that are making the decisions here and the advice they get is they pay close attention to that, and that they vaccinate the right people that they've supposed to be doing all the way along. We're all hearing stories about that in the media. Get that sorted. It needs to be sorted now. We don't have any more time. It's got to be done. That's one thing. The next thing is, well, okay, what about treatments? We were promised a whole bunch of ICU beds last year. Are they there? Has anyone checked? The health system, is it robust enough? Are there enough staff? I mean, we've got fantastic doctors and nurses and health staff in this country. They've already been through the RSV, and that's quite stressful for them. And that gives them an inkling, just a minor inkling of what would happen if things really got out of hand with COVID. And I believe it would be incredibly unfair, in fact, very rude, to not make sure that the planning is in place to protect those wonderful, fantastic front healthline staff that we've got, and GPs and everyone else like that. I think we've got an opportunity to deal with it. It's not a foregone conclusion, and I just really hope we take it, because our context is completely different.
Yeah,
we're very fortunate, and I mean, we've really got a chance here, I think, to make it work well, and I just hope we really make the most of it.
Okay, so here's a question for you, because I look at this, and you seem to have alluded to this yourself already in our discussions today. To me, it actually feels in the last week or two like the COVID crisis is actually only really just starting to kick in now. We were all panicked a year ago, but it seems to me we sort of thought, okay, it's going to be 1 year and one and done, or 2 years and then we're out. Well, I'm not convinced that is the case now. It's looking like it's really embedded itself globally. There's lots of implications for that. Even some experts talking about a 5 to 10 year sort of thing rather than just 2 years. That changes people's psyche about how they feel. You've got societies pushing back against government measures, a lot more conspiratorial and even dissenting information. It seems to me there are some seriously perilous waters ahead that need to be traversed with extreme care by societies and by governments. Otherwise, like you can already see it in the comment section around the question of vaccine passports, and you've got people effectively, we want to have a verboten sort of unclean class and separate them, and only the vaccinated people will be in the accepted class. You can see where all of this has the potential to explode in very bad ways. And it seems it's getting more dicey now. Do you think that's a fair assessment, or is it just sort of a passing thing?
Yeah, I think anyone who studied history properly and studiously knows that certain signs are there. I think that's fairly clear. I think what's happening now is we've got the transition to a different realization. So there's the acute shock of having the whole world shut down. I mean, I remember back in March last year, people saying to me, aren't we lucky we'll be all right? And I said to them, no, if this carries on, no one's going anywhere. And they came back to me, and they just ignored me at the time. They came back to me 6 months later, and they said, well, how did that happen? And I think what's happened now is that we've got over the acute shock, and now people are going, we're going to have to live with this thing. somehow we're going to have to make peace with it and with ourselves and the different way of operating. And I think you're right. I think that's the realization that's come in, and that's the actual COVID shock. It's not like, falling over and breaking your knee or something like that. After a period of time of convalescence, you're going to come right and you can go back the way you were before. I think people are very worried about the future. I'm picking up just in the mainstream people that I associate with, or just conversations with complete strangers, and they're kind of like, well, how are we going to get out of this? And there are a lot of people who are quite concerned about, what does the future hold for my business or anything like that. So I think it's, a fairly major kind of concern. But I don't think it's a hopeless situation at all, because there are a lot of incredibly intelligent and hardworking people who have some idea about, how to deal with this. And I think the recognition by Andrew Pollard that you talked about before in the UK and Singapore and other places, and even Anthony Fauci is, for the first time in the last month or so has indicated we need some kind of treatment things. The whole approach is changing. Now, on the backdrop of that, you've got, again, we're very fortunate in New Zealand. I don't think the general population really understands just how many angry people there are running around in America and in Europe at the moment in jurisdictions. This is not a standard kind of anger that you might see. This is not the anger that, like England had when they lost the final of the Euro 2020. People get over that.
Yeah, that's right.
Or when the All Blacks might lose to the English in the World Cup final. People get over that. This is a much more deep-seated frustration and anger, and they don't like being told what to do. And they don't like the way that they think things are going. And I think, so aside from the COVID, I think that's the other factor. There's a societal unrest in there that I've read, and I've heard key historians and other people who are students of history and philosophy and civilizations, and they're kind of like, some key sentinel things are appearing now that, if not controlled, they don't bode well for the next 1 or 2 years.
Well, it seems to me too that a lot of fear has been generated, and I understand, governments wanted to get people to comply, and because they were rightly scared themselves. But fear is the most effective mechanism. But then it's like a tiger, right? You feed it and feed it and feed it, and then all of a sudden you realize it's a lot bigger and stronger than you are, and it has a life of its own. And I think one thing that I think probably most sane people would have to admit is that social media has been more of a curse, really. Than like it's great you can throw lots of information quickly at people, and look, we've all got phones, and so we can scan our app and all that. But it also means people can just spread information like wildfire, regardless of reliability. It means that fear is generated a lot more easy. What's happening in Tauranga? What's going on with the ship? Everyone's fixated. They're constantly refreshing to find out who's got COVID today or right now at this moment. But it seems to me another factor here too that is not being talked about is that our loss of the sacred order in the West, which was given to us by the Judeo-Christian tradition. And even if you weren't a Christian, you lived under its mantle. As one great academic once said in Europe, who was an atheist himself, he said, even if you're an atheist and you live in the West, your dreams are always Christian dreams. You just don't realize that. And so what's happened, though, is it's left us extremely, extremely vulnerable now because there's a pandemic. And in a pandemic, what do you need? Well, you need a sense of meaning because your whole normal life's been upended. You need to confront existential dread. You need to confront death on a scale that you don't normally see in a culture that's hedonistic and doesn't even want to acknowledge death, and now has to confront it en masse. There's a rush towards libertarianism. You need ethics. You desperately need ethics and a shared vision of ethics. Relativism won't cut it when you've got to have a whole society respond to something to keep people safe. You can't have every individual just making up their own version of ethics in that situation. It seems to me that is an extremely perilous situation now because of that loss of the sacred order that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very fair and wise comment. I think. As G.K. Chesterton once said, when people stop believing in God, then they'll believe in anything. And I mean, the concept of everybody believes in something. even if you say, I believe in nothing, they believe in their family, they believe in their relationships, they believe in their job or what their job is trying to achieve, right through to people who believe in Buddha or whatever, right through to the monotheistic religions. Everybody's got some kind of belief basis, but at the core of all that, I think New Zealanders as a whole, I think it's fairly clear. New Zealanders are very concerned that people get a fair go, and New Zealanders are very altruistic, and we don't like watching other people suffer. If we can do something about it, we want to try and do something about it. And, there's an innate goodness that's there and should be recognised. I really hope to hell the kind of, anger and kind of wild stuff that we're seeing overseas. I really hope it doesn't boil over to that here. Because you can never say never. You just don't know what's going to happen. So I think some kind of structure needs to be there, and that innate goodness that I'm talking about. People get frustrated when things that should be done by systems of government or someone else, when they don't happen, that's when people can get frustrated. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it kind of is an existential crisis in a way, just as much as it is a pandemic. It just feels like there's a major system change in the air. And
well, it seems to me too like the governments, just as much as anybody else, were rushing now to try and get back to what it was before. But what it was before obviously had some issues as well. And I'm not clear that you can get back to what it was before. There's going to have to, it seems to be some sort of, well, there's going to be flow-on effects that are going to, shift balances. That always happens. And so, it's, I don't know if the dream is realistic. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, you made the point about social media before. I mean, Twitter's just toxic. It's run by this extremely odd guy who looks like a half-sucked throaty, he's got weird ambitions. He's a weird guy. And I went on there for work for things, and I got off it. It's just, it doesn't do anything for anyone. And, TikTok's this big thing right now. I mean, wow, who cares? And you're right, that kind of environment where everybody's on it. And what are you doing with your life? I won 6 Twitter battles today. I mean, who cares? You haven't really convinced anyone of anything, because there's no interpersonal relationship there. I mean, everybody knows, that in-person conversation. This is ironic, seeing as we're doing this on Zoom and on wherever this is going to end up. But you know what I mean. The best conversations you have are face to face. So I don't think social media has really helped at all in that situation. But just 2 examples that I think about I think there's a lot of fuzzy thinking going on as well. So I get blank looks when I see people say to me, I'm not taking the vaccine. It's going to change my DNA. I'm going to be turned into some kind of robot, and Bill Gates is going to control me, and it's got all these things in it. And it's really dangerous for me. And I'm like, dude, what evidence have you got for any of that? And you're telling me it's awfully horrible. And yet in the same breath, you're telling me that the virus, which is pretty much the same thing as infecting you, it's got such a high survival rate, it's a non-event. Those two ideas just don't match up. And then the other way of looking at it is, and a recent and a topical one in New Zealand. I mean, Chris Hipkins came on, I think it was last night, and he said, if we get even one case or a sniff of Delta, we're going to go into a level 4 lockdown. What's changed since that guy came over from Australia and was running around Wellington with the Delta variant, and no one got infected?
That's right.
And then the woman who came back from the UK in the new year couldn't even give it to her husband in the car. I'm not denying that Delta is a highly infectious variant, but people pick up on that. They pick up on a subtle message. And as time goes on, it percolates in the back of their head, and they go, why this inconsistency? I mean, and is Chris Hipkins' statement a genuine thing? Does he know something that the public deserves to know in terms of what he's being advised by the medical and the scientific advisors and the policy analysts? Or is it a knee-jerk reaction to what's going on in Sydney? You know, it's serious in Sydney, and you know, is he reacting to that? He doesn't want New Zealand to go down that way. But I'm surprised no one in the media has asked him, well, you weren't saying that 6 weeks ago with the Wellington dude who had Delta.
Well, this is one of the things it has concerned me is the risk here is really not so much the virus, in any virus, even Ebola. Yeah, it's deadly, it's awful, but the greater risk is really the human and social and governmental response to these things, especially in an age of some of the most advanced technology we've ever had in human history. And so there's a tendency, I think, towards a creeping technocracy, you know, a rule by technocrats, those who have the expertise. There's a tendency to perhaps try and engineer our way out of every problem, and are thinking, well, why can't we engineer it? And if we can't engineer it out quickly, like we can build a bridge, amazing bridge over a river really well, like we never used to be able to, why can't we engineer a way out of this virus? Then all of a sudden all hell breaks loose. And it just, I don't know about you, but it seems to me that one of the biggest fears I have is that governments also start to get quite attracted to this model of governance and say, well, because you're already hearing articles being published saying, well, maybe we need to start instituting lockdowns for climate change. And you start thinking, no, hold on, you know, what's going on here, you know?
Yeah, I think you touch on a good point there. I think a lot of people's frustrations are that, you know, we're nearly 2 years into the pandemic now. It came out in November 2019. So we're nearly at a 2-year point there. And people expect some kind of progress. And they also expect consistent messaging and the impression that things are getting done. And I you know, and the media, of course, love to whip things up to get clickbait, right, and sell copy. And so, you know, they have a sort of a what's the word? They have a responsibility as well to make sure that they're saying appropriate things and reporting accurately, and not causing unnecessary sort of byline, headline grabbing kind of issues for people. I think this is getting back to what we were talking about before, that people feel that there's a kind of a change in the air, and they're not sure how they feel about it. And I think it's still too early to say which way it's going to go. I really hope it doesn't end up in a dictatorial society where, you know, you have to behave in a certain way and do all these sorts of things. It kind of goes against the way that the world has gotten used to living in the Western world, certainly for the last, probably since the end of the Second World War, you know, because when the Second World War ended, everybody said, "No, we're not going there again."
Yeah.
And well, maybe we might, maybe we may not. Those who are ignorant of history are bound to repeat its mistakes, right? So,
well, and that's the point.
Be careful.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that worries me is the number of people I see online, and thankfully that's not a representative of the whole society, but who seem to be adopting the attitude, to borrow from The Simpsons, I, for one, welcome our new technocrat overlords, you know, because they'll keep me safe.
The Simpsons, they're everywhere. Yes, they predicted so many things.
They are. On that note, let's finish with 3 quick fire questions from you. I'll put to you. Sorry. Number 1 is, if you could sum up in a sentence or 2, what advice would you give to lay people right now about COVID and about vaccines? If you could just sum it up quickly, what would you say if someone asked you?
Get yourself educated about what the vaccines are doing. Get yourself educated. If you have any concerns about side effects, go onto the Ministry of Health website, go and even talk to your GP or anyone else like that. Look online from reputable sources, things like medical clinics. Don't go and look at Dr. Jim's, Health Tonic Society online that says that COVID's going to make you have 3 horns and glow. That's just rubbish. Look for reputable sources, medical clinics, medical professionals, and get yourself educated about it. And ask questions of your GP or a medical professional who's dealing with you. Given what you know about my health status, can I expect certain side effects or anything? And if you're happy with those answers, fine. Educate yourself, I think, is a key thing.
Okay. Number 2 is I'm starting to hear murmurs that there might be a sort of an underground conversation happening with experts like yourself, who are not. You don't hear it publicly, but they're not anti-vax. They're not downplaying COVID, but they're also saying maybe there's better ways of doing things. Do you think that there is that sort of underground conversation happening a little bit? Do you think the experts are talking differently?
Yeah, I think the underground conversation has been happening for a while, and I know that there are differences of opinion. That doesn't mean that people don't agree. It's kind of like how many flavors can you make ice cream? It's still ice cream, right?
Yeah.
I think there are just differences and you can imagine sitting around a cabinet table or a clinical advisory group meeting table. I've been around. I've sat in rooms with fairly high-hitting senior medical officials, and they've all got slightly different takes on things. I think there is, the senior people that we hear of in the media. I've got a lot of respect for David Skegg. He is world class. And I take what he says very seriously. He knows what he's talking about, and so I would encourage people, they find people like that who they trust and, pay attention to what they say, because he's eminently qualified to be commenting on how things should go. But within the medical advice that any government will receive within New Zealand, all of them will be working towards what's best for New Zealand, what's best for the population. I have no doubt about that. And so there may be differences of opinion about how to practically engage, but I think I'm kind of getting the impression from people that I've talked with, like one senior medical person who's been in the media a lot about COVID that I know that I've spoken with. He just made the passing comment one day. He said it can't go on like this forever. And he was concerned that we can't keep doing the same thing. You can't have a hammer in your hand and keep thinking everything's a nail.
Yeah.
That's not a sophisticated, it's not a clever approach. Stuff has to change.
Last question then. What advice would you give to lay people who perhaps are a little bit concerned about the reliability of information? And this could go either way. And which sources can be trusted to keep them properly informed. I guess that's an ever-changing and ever-moving feast each day. But I guess the first thing probably is don't cherry-pick, right? And also be open to being corrected. We don't like that. That's our pride, and we like to hold our ideas as if they are, absolutely infallible. And that's dangerous, our blind spots we don't know about. But what would you say to people who think, well, where do I go, Chris? Who's trustworthy, who's not? How do I check the reliability of information I'm getting from any source?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, and it's more and more difficult in this age when there's social media and so many different competing. I mean, if you open a newspaper these days, you'll say you look at News Hub or the New Zealand Herald or stuff or whatever, you'll have the same thing, and it's reported with sometimes completely different takes on what, not necessarily what someone said, but what they meant by what they said. So I think you need to get objective medical advice from experts, people like David Skeggs. If you're thinking about, what policy in a public health sort of thing going forward should we be looking at? If you're looking about things about vaccines and stuff, like I said before, go onto reputable sites, medically based ones, not sort of ancillary or opinion-based things, and ask around. I know it's very difficult in this day and age, and I've been at this game for 30 years in terms of research, and you learn a few tricks of the trade and trying to filter As scientists, you get trained to filter out of research papers and things, what seems real and what might not be real, and you have your own gut feeling that comes with that. I would encourage people to read widely, and follow the adage, if you think something's too fantastic to be true, it probably isn't true. Other than that, I'm not an expert on following these things, so I'm not going to give someone advice about how to interpret things, or how they should interpret them. I would just encourage them to read as widely as they can.
Chris, that's awesome. And again, thank you so much for being with us here today to have this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I found it informative. And I think, to be honest with you, I think it's the kind of dialogue we need more of, right? Take the heat out of it all for a bit and just let's have honest conversations about this, and rather than sort of bashing each other over the head and calling each other names and engaging in false dichotomies. Let's just have conversations and dialogue a bit more with listening, right?
I think that's key. I think you've finished on the right note there, Brendan, that there's got to be mutual respect between parties. You can disagree with someone on a number of different things, but you can still sit down and have a beer with them. We're all in this together, and we're not each other's enemies. It's not between us. And try and focus and see things from a slightly different point of view. And it's you may choose to reject that view, but if you do it in a dialogue of mutual respect and not being offensive, things are going to be a lot better the whole way around, I think.
Awesome, Chris. Thank you so much.
Excellent. No problem.
When we wake, hear the birds and see the sun. Side by side, our fears are done. Oh, the good times just begun. We know what we have, let's hold on tight. Found what we're looking for in life. Call us crazy, but things are finally right. With you and I, the future is bright.